for organizing this very promising conference from the beginning. Thank you so much, Gavin, for presenting the issue of textual studies and manuscript. Without further ado, I will begin my presentation about targums and entanglements. Now, we all know what are targums, but just so we know what we're all talking about, we'll go very quickly through this brief presentation. Some will probably already know it by heart. So Targum, the Aramaic word for both interpretation and translation, design refers to a group of Jewish Aramaic translations of the Bible. Well, sort of translations, not exactly translation, because first they accompany rather than replace the Hebrew text, and second, they do not only translate but also interpret, paraphrase, and expand the text in various ways. The Targums are different compositions coming from different times and regions, written in various Aramaic dialects, and have different approaches both in terms of translation and exegesis of the Hebrew text. To give a very general and a very simplified overview, the fragment of Aramaic translations in Iran, whether or not Targums, will leave it for another discussion. The standard so-called Targums for the Pentateuch and the prophets are Onqelos and Jonathan, probably arising from the 1st century CE, give or take. Perhaps somewhat later as a group of Palestinian Targums, I will say more about it in a few minutes. And from probably the end of the first millennium, early Middle Ages, come the Targums to writings, again a various group, and a third Targum to the Pentateuch, so-called Pseudo-Jonathan, also related to the Palestinian Targums in a way. All of these different compositions are known to us through, of course, manuscripts, which are very late, sometimes very, very late. And this is the focus of my study in general and of my presentation today. I will look on the manuscripts, the medieval manuscripts, and try to say something about the early development of the Pentateuchal Targums. Talking about Pentateuchal Targums, let's say a few more words. First, the Palestinian Targums, I use the plural form intentionally. These are texts in transition. In which manner? First of all, just to clarify, Palestinian, because they are written in the Jewish Palestinian Aramaic dialect, was spoken, or at least used in late antique Palestine. Presumably, this is also the date and provenance of these compositions, with some question marks. These texts are known through multiple sources in multiple versions, but nevertheless are preserved in only a handful of manuscripts. I believe less than 15 all in all, again, give or take, which present, let's say, the divergences between them perhaps reflect also a continuous tradition, not simply a static text, but a Targum that goes on and develops and changes, perhaps as late as medieval times, perhaps even in Europe. Again, these issues are under debate. If you want to know more, ask Gavin, he wrote about it. In contrast to the Palestinian Targums is Targum Onqelos, which is a text in transmission, a very clearly literary entity transmitted more or less intact. My study focuses mainly on its transmission in Europe. And here we speak about, again, the standard Targum of the Pentateuch, known through hundreds of manuscripts, mainly from the 13th to the 15th century, or even later, sometimes. All of these manuscripts present a highly stable text, more or less. We do find here multiple variants, minor, but still numerous. Many times we find, or most of them represent what we could consider secondary readings. Secondary readings can be seen on the one hand as corruptions to an original text, but also as innovations, as developments to the text. That's both a matter of approach, but also a matter of different types of variants. And most important for the present discussion, some of these variants could reflect familiarity with alternative traditions, either alternative, let's say, forms of Onqelos, or perhaps even alternative Targums that somehow found their way into Onqelos. And this is where I begin the bulk of my presentation, points of contact between the Pentateuchal Targums. Perhaps the most obvious of these contacts is the phenomenon known as Tosefta. Literally, Tosefta is addition. We speak about additional Targum, that is expansive passages, renderings of specific verses, which somehow circulate alongside Onqelos, one way or another. Moreover, these Tosefta derive from Palestinian Targums, sometimes, but I will not go into it because first, these passages are well known. They have been thoroughly discussed time and again, including by myself. And lastly, I simply have no time. So the Tosefta will be left outside of the presentation, and we'll be happy to address it in the Q&A. If anyone raises the issue. The concepts I would like to speak about are more subtle and perhaps more ambiguous. We'll begin with occasional inclusions. By this I mean to sporadic variants appearing here and there in few manuscripts. Most of the times, or even all the times, are very clearly unreliable. They are secondary in relation to the main Onqelos, and those that I will speak about are also related one way or another to the Palestinian Targum tradition. For instance, a variant in Leviticus 11:13 in a list of the unclean birds, which mentions also the ayah, maybe a kite, maybe some other bird. The Hebrew text mentions the and ayah, according to the species. Onqelos translates them as daita and tarafita. This is the word we'll be looking on. Few Onqelos manuscripts listed here below mention use of birds daita, the tarafita, and ibu, which is clear interpolation because suddenly we have three birds instead of two. And this ibu doesn't come from nowhere. It has its parallel in the Palestinian tradition, here in manuscript Nofiti, which mentions daita and ebu. A clear case of a Palestinian interpolation. Let us have a look on a more complicated case, this time from Genesis 52, which describes the burial, the embalming of Jacob by the Egyptian physicians. Masoretic text mentions rofim, physicians, and the verb chanat, to embalm. Onqelos rendered these words by aswata, physicians, and the verb chanat with the Aramaic verb chanat. Very creative. But at least one Onqelos manuscript today in Berlin presents a different version. It translates rofim as asaya, a different morphology, and the verb chanat it renders with basam. It means more or less the same, but nevertheless a different verb. Now, these variants, again, do not come from nowhere. In one Palestinian version, Palestinian Targum version, in manuscript Nofiti, we find that rofim are rendered asaya, like in manuscript Berlin, and chanat is rendered chanat, as in Onqelos. Another Palestinian Targum source, coming this time from the margins of manuscript Nofiti, renders chanat with basam, like manuscript Berlin, and rofim as wata, like Onqelos. So it appears that manuscript Berlin use different readings, different versions, which are related to the Palestinian Targums. Perhaps he had different Palestinian Targums and compiled them. Perhaps, actually, it relies on a Palestinian Targum source which did not come down to us. At least as an open question. My third example refers not to a single verse, but to a single witness. This is manuscript VN National State Library 28, a Pentateuch with Targum Onqelos, probably from the first half of the 14th century, which abounds with unique and peculiar readings. Usually they have no claim for originality, but still interesting. Some of them, once in a while, are related to the Palestinian tradition, and I would like to look on a few examples, all taken from the Song of the Sea, from Exodus 15, a chapter which everyone knows very well. We'll get back to you. So let's begin. In verse 4, manuscript VN presents the reading Ushfa Ulemeki, the best of his young men, which departs from Onqelos, who reads about, speaks about Nivchar or Shfa Gibarohi, his warriors. Now this word Ulemeki has its parallel in the Palestinian Targum, in manuscript Nofiti, which speaks about Ushfa Ulemei. But also the Onqelos reading, Gibarohi, his warriors, appears in Nofiti Targum, reads Olimegi Boy, I don't know, these young warriors. We'll get back to this, what appears like a double reading. Next, verse 6, Onqelos mentions Tavat Sana'a, who broke the enemy. The N28 has a more expanded version. Tavat Sana'a U'ayl Dvava, you broke the enemy and the adversary. And this, let's say, expanded reading appears, guess where, in manuscript Neofiti, which says Tavat Paro Sana'a U'ayl Dvava, you broke Pharaoh, the enemy, and the adversary. Next, in verse 13, manuscript Vien mentions Medor Bet Shkintach, the, let's say, place of the locale of your presence, or Shekhinah, you translate Shekhinah. Onqelos speaks here only about Dira de Kushach, the place of your holiness. The ends 28 divergent reading, Medor Bet Shkintach, appears in Neofiti, Medor Bet Shkhinah, but also Kushach, holiness, appears in Neofiti. Again, what appears like a mixture, it is in mind. Last, in verse 17, Onqelos mentions Atar Mitukan, a prepared place. The N28 uses different wording, Atar Nezuman, and whereas which means the same. And whereas the reading Mitukan is very stable throughout the manuscripts of Onqelos, the reading Nezuman again appears in manuscript Neofiti, in the Palestinian tradition. So what do we have here? First of all, an unusual concentration of Palestinian readings. As I said, these type of variants tend to be sporadic, and even in manuscript Vien, usually they appear very far apart. So the concentration here is noteworthy, and it is likely related to a phenomena or to a type of Targum that can be called a festival Targum or the liturgical Targum, and by this I mean specific chapters from the Pentateuch, including Exodus 15, that were read, whose Targum was read in public in medieval synagogues as part of the festival liturgy. Now, this publicly read Targum is not simply Onqelos, it derives from the Palestinian Targum, but it's not exactly Palestinian, it's a special Targum. Anyway, this is a, let's say, kind of Palestinian Targum that was current, was read in medieval Europe, relatively widespread, and could have been known to medieval scribes. So perhaps this reading were mediated through it. Last but not least, you see here the mixture of the red and the blue on the third column that should be Palestinian. Perhaps some of what we see here is a sign of cross influence. So not only Palestinian Targum affecting Onqelos in some witnesses, but also Onqelos affecting Palestinian Targum in some witnesses. And again, we're looking, I call it Palestinian Targum, but this is actually manuscript Neofiti, a very, very late manuscript. It's a 16th century manuscript. Its scribes were most likely aware of Onqelos. Could it be that some Onqelos readings found their way into this representative of Palestinian Targum? Yes, they could. Again, I leave this as an open question. So what have we seen thus far? We've seen multiple examples of the circulation of Palestinian Targum in Europe. Some scribes were familiar with Palestinian Targum and did something with it, but we've also seen that it is limited. I mentioned again, these kind of variants are rare and sporadic, and the Palestinian Targum circulated not only in very limited extent, but also perhaps it was mediated. I mentioned the festival Targum, that could be a channel through which Palestinian readings found their ways. There are other ways. So not every Palestinian reading perhaps necessarily reflects direct familiarity with let's say, genuine source of Palestinian Targum or genuine Palestinian Targum. These examples, these interpolations, also say something about, also reflect revision and improvement to Onqelos, which raises questions concerning the status of Onqelos. What is the fact that scribes felt themselves free and allowed to deal with it, to change it, to adapt it according to different tendencies, not necessarily in alignment with the Hebrew, by the way. It also says something about status of Aramaic. Aramaic is not, Hebrew is the mainland of creation in medieval, for medieval Jews, but here we see that Aramaic is also important, how would I say, for literary creation. It is not only preserved, but also adapted and changed according to different people's taste and understanding of this language and text. Last but not least, it is important to remember that this phenomena is of limited extent. So it tells us something about the reception of Onqelos in the Middle Ages and transmission in some areas at some time, but it doesn't affect that much the larger story of the transmission of Onqelos from, let's say, late antiquity to the early Middle Ages. So it is an interesting curiosity, important for medieval Europe, but less so for the larger picture. Let us have a look on another type of contact, and this time ubiquitous interpolations. What is this? Let us look at two examples. First, from Numbers 24, the story of Balaam's oracles. At this point of the story, in 24 verse 1, the Hebrew text said that Balaam, Vayashet el Hamidbar Panav, he set his face to the wilderness, so very clear why. Onqelos renders literally, as usual, Ushvi lemad bera apori, and he set his face to the wilderness. In the Palestinian Targum tradition, it begins again literally, Ushvi lemad bera apori, but then adds, Vahava madkar on evada de egla. So Balaam set his face to the wilderness in order to evoke the sin of the calf of the Israelites. And this addition, in a different form, appears also in a very large group of Onqelos witnesses who read Ushvi lokabel aikla davadu Israel b'mad bera apori, and he set his face toward the calf which the Israelites did in the wilderness. Not exactly the same, but certainly, different wording, but the same addition. And this, presumably, addition appears in over 70% of the whole textual tradition of Onqelos. Second example, again from Numbers, this time from Numbers 32, which gives us a list of toponym, list of cities, a list of Transjordanian cities, Atavot, Bedivon, Viazer, Benimra, and so on and so forth. I will not read it through. This is a Hebrew text. Onqelos is identical. It simply gives the Hebrew, the place names without altering any of them. The Palestinian Targum tradition diverges from the Hebrew. Some manuscripts, in this case, this is a fragment Targum V, translate or identify some of the names. Pseudo Jonathan, which is not a Palestinian Targum, but is related to the Palestinian Targum tradition, translates almost all of the names. And interesting enough, these or similar translations appear also in many Onqelos manuscripts. Sometimes they're almost identical to Pseudo Jonathan or to the Palestinian Targum tradition, with one exception. Sometimes they diverge a little more, and sometimes even more. In general, the inner variation between Onqelos manuscripts is extremely high in this case, but nevertheless they're always related one way or another to the Palestinian renderings of this verse. And these Palestinian translations sort of appear in about 50% of the whole textual tradition. So what do I take out of these examples? First of all, we have here variant readings in Onqelos which are ambiguous. Are they Onqelos or are they something else? Are they part of Onqelos or are they alien elements that on their way into it? And this ambiguity found its reflection in the manuscripts. Many of these, in many witnesses, these readings appear as marginal notes or otherwise are clearly marked as interpolations. Sometimes there are also explicit comments reflecting the, how to say, different source of these readings, both in the manuscripts and by medieval authors. And I will mention here only one comment concerning Numbers 32, the list of toponyms from the Tosafot, not Tosefta. These are Talmudic commentators, no relation to the Tosefta. Tosafot is a collective commentary on Babylonian Talmud. This commentary probably from Naz, German French, probably mid-13th century, and concerning numbers 32, the Tosafot comment that although there is no known Targum for this verse, but rather a Yerushalmi Targum, it is better to read this Targum. So the Tosafot clearly differentiate between the known Targum, which is Onqelos, and is lacking here, and the Yerushalmi, which we do have. They also prefer the Yerushalmi, for reasons which I won't come here, and simply put, the Yerushalmi here supplements Onqelos. I'll get back to this. So the ambiguous status of this edition is perhaps related to the fact that they are textually very unstable, in contrast to the, let's say, main or usual text of Onqelos, which is by and large static. Here in this particular interpolations or non-interpolations, I find a very high degree of variation, quite frustrating. And last but not least, as I said, as we've seen, these interpolations are widespread. Why? What made them so popular in the medical manuscript tradition? So perhaps their content is appealing. People were fond of the story about Balaam and the calf. And perhaps because they're used to supplement Onqelos. This is certainly the case concerning the toponyms in numbers 32. But I think that these, there might be also a very different explanation, and that these interpolations were already included in some archetype, in an early stage of the manuscript tradition. And in other words, they are there because they are there. They're simply multiplied and copied as part of Onqelos, which raises then the question, are we speaking about interpolations, about foreign elements that somehow crept into Onqelos, or are we simply speaking about a variant? It's a different version of Onqelos. It's more expanded, it's strange, but it's still simply Onqelos of a different type. And with this question in mind, I'll move to the last type of contacts I would like to present today, and these are variants, and more particularly European variants. By European, I mean that they are only attested in European witnesses. What is their source? Well, we'll see. Let's start with the first example from the very beginning, Genesis 1:2, which describes Choshech al pnei tehom, darkness upon the abyss. Onqelos, as usual, renders literally Chashocha ala pei tehoma, darkness upon the abyss. But a large group of European, of Onqelos manuscripts, all of them variants, all of them European, present a variant reading. Chashocha Paris ala pei tehoma. No relation to the Olympic Games, of course. The darkness is spread upon the abyss. Now, this reading is so characteristic of the European tradition that if you open a manuscript and see that the second verse is Chashocha Paris, you can be quite sure that it will present the other characteristic European tradition. Now, where is this reading coming from? Other than that it makes good sense, it is also found in the Palestinian Targum tradition. Here also Chashocha Paris, ala pei tehoma. Next example is a bit more complicated, comes from Genesis 4, the story of Cain, Abel, and their offerings. In the Masoretic text, in the Hebrew, the offerings of Cain and Abel are called mincha, which is a slightly ambiguous, slightly obscure, opaque wording. It appears 3 times in the narrative. Onqelos renders mincha as kurbana, offering, in all 3 times. Makes sense. But again, a large group of Onqelos witnesses reads tikrovta, gift, in the first verse, and korbana, offering, in the next 2 verses. Why was this distinction made? Good question. I can only say that it is consistent. I mean, tikrovta doesn't appear randomly in different verses, but always in the first one. There is a graphic similarity between tikrovta and kurbana, but first of all, they're not that similar that they could simply interchange. And second, as I said, tikrovta doesn't appear randomly, so the graphic confusion alone cannot be the explanation. Something else is happening here. I don't know entirely why, again, but I can at least mention that in the Palestinian Targum tradition, surprise, surprise, we found a similar distinction. In 51, the first occurrence of mincha is rendered doron, gift, and the other occurrences are rendered korban, gift. So the word is different, but the same distinction is made between the first gift and the two other offerings. Last example, simpler one, and we come back to a verse that we've seen in Exodus 15:4 about the Pharaoh's warriors. In the Hebrew, read about Mivchav Shanshav, the chosen of his warriors of some sort. Onqelos, according to many manuscripts, renders literally Mivchav Gibarohi, the chosen of his warriors. But a large group of witnesses, all the European, read here a different word, Ushfa Gibarohi, the best of his warriors. No real difference in meaning, but still a different phrase. And this different wording is again related to the Palestinian Targum tradition, which reads Ushfa, or the maybe Gibarohi, or other versions. What does this all come up? Do these variants reflect contact with Palestinian Targum? I mean, I've just shown you cases of Palestinian Targum that affected some medieval manuscripts, but this is very unlikely to have been the case here because these readings are so widespread. So it's possible that one scribe here or there was familiar or introduced Palestinian readings into his manuscript. It is very unlikely that throughout the Ashkenazi or European tradition, scribes, first of all, had access to Palestinian Targums, and second, decided to alter specifically these readings. We're more likely dealing here with variants that were already included in the archetype of the European textual tradition, which was perhaps Palestinianized. Was it somehow affected by Palestinian readings, and if so, how? Are we talking about an archetype that had interpolations? So an Onqelos manuscript, well inside that for some reason in some areas was corrected or altered according to a, let's say, Palestinian Targum or a Palestinian Targum tradition, or perhaps we have here common traditions. So simply the Onqelos type, which was also known to the Palestinian tradition. And here we're not talking about influences. We're talking about something much deeper, Targum tradition, which is common to Onqelos on the one hand, or at least one branch of Onqelos, and the Palestinian tradition on the other. One way or another, what is the let's say, context or background of this hypothetical archetype? Do we have here a Palestinian archetype, or can we speak about Palestinian variants that is variant that reflects a transmission of Onqelos in a Palestinian context, whether in Palestine itself, or at least in place where the Palestinian Targum tradition was in wide circulation. I cannot answer these questions, but it's important to write them. And to conclude or to offer some final thoughts, because there's no real conclusion for this presentation. First of all, it's important to stress that I presented diverse phenomena. So when speaking about relationship between Onqelos and the Palestinian Targums, we're talking about a group of different textual happenings, textual events, with different textual and historical, also cultural backgrounds. Cannot put them all in the same bucket and under the same explanation, but remember that each and every case or each and every type of contact has to be dealt on its right and on its own terms. Certainly, I hope I managed to convince you about the value of European variants, at least some of them. They're not simply secondary readings or unthoughtful corruption to Onqelos. Sometimes they can reflect all perhaps earlier events in the development of Onqelos. Even if they're secondaries, they might go back to very early developments in the transmission of this Targum. And last but not least, in a more general way, I try to demonstrate some fuzzy borders, both in relation to the transmission of the Targums, how in medieval times scribes allow themselves to transfer readings from one Targum to the other, for various reasons, again, but also perhaps during the final reduction of these Targums. So perhaps you think not simply of fixed and crystallized text being transmitted as they are, but of texts that come in contact with each other, change each other as they receive their final form. Perhaps we can not so easily even speak of a text. Perhaps when we speak about Onqelos, we could think about different readings of Onqelos from the very beginning, that is, from the beginning that is available to us, which is immensely perplexing for theologians, but also has some promises to be familiar with, how to say, different use and different forms of the text that came down to us from antiquity. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward for your questions and comments.
Oh, yes. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your feedback on my presentation, hopefully. So, in many of, or most of the variants which you listed, Klein's Masorata Targum Onqelos lists those variants and oftentimes specifies the variants as the incorrect readings. I'm wondering whether in your research you have had opportunity to interact with the Masorata Targum Onqelos in relation to these questions.
Yes, constantly. First of all, I'm very happy you raised it because the Masorata is a highly important source. Well, for various reasons, also as a repository of variant readings of Onqelos. And I constantly use it. To what extent readings preserved in the Masorah present Palestinian readings is a question that was raised by some scholars. Needs to be looked into more systematically. I think it also under more clear definition of what considers Palestinian, because it's much more complicated than it was. I mean, if you're confused from what I present, then very good, but the issue that situation is even more complicated than that. And as for the, I would say, judgments of the Masorah, where this reading is correct or incorrect, or proper or improper, I don't take them too seriously. For me, it's important that the Masorah records an alternative reading. The fact that a particular reading is marked as incorrect or improper, for me, it tells little. At the best, it tells that at a certain point, some Masoretes or even some scribe prefer the different reading. What it tells is perhaps worth examining on its own right, but it doesn't say that this reading is can be neglected or is not Onqelos in its essence. And we should add here that in many cases, the Masorah or some Masorah collections simply say another version, so and so. So they also give different reading without any judgment. Did I answer your question?
I think so. So yes, just trying to understand what your thoughts are on the value of the Masorata Targum Onqelos, and evaluating some of these questions that you're getting into about. Are we dealing with interpolations? Are we dealing with variant additions and like that? Thank you.
I think that eventually I think that in this sense, I think the Masorah cannot help to decide if an alternative reading is an interpolation or something else. It can also tell us that by the time that this note was made, whether in 9th century Babylonia or 15th century Italy, because this is how long the Masorah notes evolved. So by this time, this reading or this alternative reading was known. Now, how it relates to Onqelos and whether or not it is real Onqelos or not, I will judge according by, how to say, the inner information, or by a study of the variant itself, how well it incorporates into Onqelos, how it relates to other sources, and so on and so forth. But the fact that the Masorah says this is the wrong reading is of negligible importance in this judgment, for this particular topic.
First of all, thank you very much. This was very, very rich paper with many variants, which are very interesting to see. And I like your emphasis on the fact that you can't speak about the real Onqelos, so to speak, but about the evolving Onqelos, and that's very, very nice. I just have some questions, not sure whether that's correct or not, but in some cases, some of the variants do not necessarily involve another source, I would say. I can't remember who said it, but it was in connection with Qumran. You can also have substitution by synonyms. And when you talked about Osfar and Michar, I thought, well, this could also be a synonym which some scribe perhaps preferred, doesn't necessarily have to refer to another source. And I also wondered about how you feel the development, and it may be actually manifold, but whether some of these variants were first glosses, which are then incorporated into the main text, either because someone preferred it or because someone thought it was a correction, something that had been missing, or whether a scribe, when copying from his exemplar, inserted it.
Concerning the first question, I completely agree. Again, thank you very much for bringing this up. I presented a rather, let's say, one-sided. I presented this example in a rather one-sided way, and indeed, many of them can be explained in other ways, and Shvar and perhaps Shvar and Mifchar is perhaps the most obvious. So I agree, it can be just a replace. I mean, in essence, that's exactly what it is. There's a substitute between synonyms. Now, I included it here because the fact that this exact synonym is found in the Palestinian tradition and it's stable in the various Palestinian Targum sources is something that eventually I felt I cannot ignore. And well, also in order to present the ambiguity. I mean, yes, I have a long list of Palestinian interpolations. Most of them are marked with question marks, exactly because this kind of question, because many times, let's say when the Palestinian reading is more literal than Onqelos, and some aspects of Onqelos offer this literal rendering of the Hebrew, so while it's familiar with the Palestinian tradition, it is simply a scribe that decides to offer, presents a literal reading, which happens also quite often. In many cases, we simply can't. Concerning the inclusion of losses, it certainly happened. I mean, as we can see it happening, there are many, well, both in Onqelos and in the Palestinian Targum, we found double readings, which one of the possible ways of the development is exactly this: glosses or comments that somehow became incorporated into the main text. So one scribe writes a gloss, the scribe coming after him copied it into the main text because he decided to or because he didn't understand what it's meant to be. I should only add that double readings and let's say glosses, I mean things that are in essence are glosses, can also be added in the process of, let's say, deduction or recreation. So someone who, I don't know, is creating a Targum or reworking a Targum and is familiar with different translations or different renderings of a given word, can decide to bring into the Targum these different readings. Sometimes they can be superficially combined, like we see Uleme Gibaroi, so his young warriors. It's an acceptable syntactic structure, but when comparing it to other Targums, we see that in fact these are two different renderings that were combined, and sometimes without any combination. So these things, let's say, they certainly happened during the medieval transmission, but written transmission. Perhaps in some cases they also reflect happenings in the, let's say, reductional or in the time of the creation of the Targums, and each case on its own merit.
Yeah, because in order to do that, you at least need two manuscripts in front of you.
Either two manuscripts or to be familiar with several traditions.
Right, yeah.
And again,
familiarity in great detail.
Sorry.
Sorry, that requires a familiarity in great detail.
Yes.
I think that doesn't really happen without an exemplar in the examples that you showed.
Again, so again, say in the medieval period, in the age of manuscripts, the manuscripts came down to us, it's almost certainly a matter of, let's say, marginal glosses or something similar that crept into the text. And my last point was that these kind of double readings can also arise or originate from the much earlier stages that we can call reduction or even composition, when someone composing a Targum or reworking a Targum, either written or oral, is familiar with several Targums. It's not even complete Targums. It's not that you are familiar that in this verse, this word is translated in several different ways, so you introduce these different ways into your Targum.
Thank you very much. There was a point that we didn't speak about, which is for example, your first example, where you spoke about Hanat versus Basim. So when the variant of Targum Onqelos uses Basim and uses the infinitive, so instead of using, it doesn't use the late Western Aramaic form Nifasama.
I will get to it eventually. Yes. Almost there.
Warning flashing in
It's the undoing of the presentation.
video.
There it is.
Yes. So what you have here is not just the replacement of the verbal lexeme, but you have the Onqelos uses
The kal infinitive lemichnat.
No. I'm talking about the variant. So whereas Neofiti uses lamvasama, the variant of Onqelos uses levasama, right?
Right.
So, which is the older Aramaic infinitive of Payeb.
We can also call it the Onqelos form. This is a kind of infinitive that Onqelos wouldn't use.
Right, that's what I mean. That's what I'm saying. So it's on the one hand, the verbal root or the verbal lexeme is the one found in Neofiti, but the morphology is the morphology of Onqelos. Meaning the person, if this is the influence of a Palestinian Targum on Onqelos, it means that someone knew the grammar of Targum Onqelos and knew to adapt the morphology of Neofiti to the morphology of Targum Onqelos.
Yeah, exactly.
No, but the question is it, first of all, do you have examples where that doesn't happen, where the forms incorporated into Targum Onqelos are actually, don't have, the wrong morphology? Let's say the morphology of late Western Aramaic of Targum Neofiti or the Palestinian Targums? That's one question. And the other question is if we should expect scribes in medieval Europe to have known how to adapt these forms, or does that tell us that it is very early, because it means that whoever did it really knew the Aramaic grammar of Onqelos, very well.
Very interesting. There is a reason to bring it here. Great, excellent question. Thank you very much. Also, thank you for pointing this out. We'll never have time to do it during the presentation. I tend
And of course, you also have it with ohi and oi, which is not as significant like gibarohi and gibaroi, which is also, you know, in Neofiti you have oi, and Onqelos you have ohi.
So concerning oi and ohi, I think the scribes are more aware of that.
Yeah,
but also I would say that the forms also fluctuate even within Onqelos manuscripts.
That's why I didn't stress that one as well, but this one is more.
So concerning the question, is it possible that medieval scribes are familiar enough with Onqelos grammar, or at least with Onqelos morphology? That is the same. I tend now to say some of them did. Some of them were familiar enough with Onqelos to, how would I say, feel that levasama is the right form. So I mean, even a scribe finding lam vasama in his main text, in his, let's say, Palestinian Targum, and say, wait, that doesn't sound right. It should be levasama. His name is not there. Even if he's not able to formulate the exact rule, they know how Onqelos works.
So it doesn't prove that it's your error.
I tend to say it doesn't. That it rather shows Aramaic literacy, at least of this scribe, over his source. But in actuality, we need, or I will need to go more deeply to examine systematically this particular manuscript and see what kind of changes it does. Let's see, first of all, how it relates to the usual average text of Onqelos, and when it diverges from it, does it reflect knowledge of Aramaic, or what we would consider good knowledge of Aramaic, or is it completely random? No, not random. Because there are also examples of, let's say, reworking or adaptation of Aramaic which are outrageous. I mean, see people doing things that apparently attempt to produce better Aramaic, but are certainly not. This happens quite often. Again, it's interesting on its own right, trying to know what type of Aramaic people know in the medieval age and how they refer to it, but it's definitely medieval. Was there another question? Where we found interpolation that preserved Jewish Palestinian morphology, we need to look for my examples. I'm sure we do. Again, in the very particular case of the Festival Targum, which is to some extent either reworking of Palestinian Targum according to Onqelos or amalgamation of Onqelos and Palestinian Targum, you find the morphologies in mixture. But then again, also there is a high degree of variation between the various witnesses of Festival Targum, so it's a whole area of study on its own right. If you want to know more, ask Yevon. He has just submitted his PhD dissertation about the Festival Targum. Ask him.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation, and I found it very helpful when you're talking about text here, and you're getting actually to the text. And I want to raise one in particular. Is there a difference between Dorot and Korban? Because in the end, are they trying, I think it was the Palestinian variant reading that you were using there that had those two words. Are they trying to make a distinction between Cain's sacrifice and Abel's sacrifice with those two words? So my point is you can't really get away from content analysis or theological analysis in order to evaluate the distinction that's being made with vocabulary. So it's that larger context that I'm looking for a little bit. So can you help me with this specific one? Second question I have, I'll just throw it out, is you mentioned something to the effect that Onqelos may not have been used in its entirety in the liturgical reading. Am I reading it correct? Did I understand you correctly there? Only in festivals, only in certain festivals?
Yes.
Do we know that all of Onqelos was not included at some point in the liturgical year?
So I'll start with the second point.
Okay.
First of all, my comment referred only to medieval Europe. I'm not speaking about the use of Onqelos or used Aramaic Targum in the Talmudic period, only in medieval Europe. Now in medieval Europe, not by and large, in medieval Europe, Targum is not included in liturgy on plan. It's a text known, it's studied, but it's not. But there is the institution of reading Targum along the reading of the Torah has ceased for centuries, except for the festivals. And festivals actually mean only Pesach and Shavuot. So in these particular liturgies, in these particular festivals, which included also reading of specific portions from the Torah and the prophets, and these portions were accompanied by reading of the Targum, which was, again, not exactly Onqelos, but a different type of Targum, kind of Palestinian. So in the liturgical life of some medieval Jewish communities in Europe, the practice of public reading of Targum survived or was known only as part of the festival liturgy. So when we speak about the transmission perspective, the presence of Targum in medieval life, we should think on the one hand of the written texts as part of the known for the literati, which were known in their entirety. There were again hundreds of manuscripts of Onqelos, tens of manuscripts of Jonathan in their entirety, no problem about that. But as part of the liturgical life, or if you like the immediate experience, it was limited to the festivals of Pesach and Shavuot. And again, this liturgical Targum, this publicly read Targum, was actually not Onqelos. It's well different. Now, as for the second question about Cain and Abel, I will not go back to the slide. You're definitely correct. I mean, if I try to understand why this distinction was made, so certainly the answer has to be, relates to content, to exegesis, ideologies, but perhaps also to style. I didn't want to go into it because for me the only important thing was to demonstrate that the same distinction, which is not obvious, is taken both by some European ministers of Onqelos and the Palestinian tradition. Why it is done, a good question. Whether it is meant to distinguish between Cain's offering and Abel's offering, that sounds very appealing, but it's not the case. Because the way that the biblical narrative goes, it declares, first of all, Cain brought his mincha, then Abel brought his, and God favored Abel's mincha, but rejected Cain's mincha. So the first mincha, so we have Cain, Abel, Cain. If we want to distinguish between Cain's mincha and Abel's mincha, we need to have a different wording in the second verse, which we do find. This is what the Septuagint does. Yeah. Septuagint has, I think, offering for Cain and gift for Abel. If you like, we'll have like offering, gift, offering. Some manuscripts of Onqelos do the same, but the opposite. They have gift, offering, gift. This is exactly a distinction between Cain and Abel. But what we see on the slide, which is not on the screen, is gift for Cain, offering for Abel, gift for Cain. So it's not a distinction between Cain and Abel, it's a distinction between the first mention of mincha and the other two. Why? I don't have any good answer. Because it could even be a slip of the pen.
What?
It could even be a slip of the pen. So someone changed or revoked the Targum, but forgot to change the other two. What does that say about
traditions? In both traditions? In both European tradition and then...
Yeah, that's it. It's not impossible, but it would say something about no fitting.
Yeah.
Another option that we have is something literary, that you begin with one word and, I don't know, maybe Tikulte is more general and Kolbana is more specific, so you begin with a general and move to the specific. I don't have a good answer.
But could it not be that in the first time it's a different word used, and the second time God rejects it as an offering, so then they could use the other word, because it's rejected.
Good.
So it could, and then that solution could still work. I don't know, I didn't look at the text closely, but.
I'm saying some I mean, there must be some, the explanation has to be in terms of content. Again, whether this is literary or theological, put it this way, I do not know. But it's certainly not, it is very likely not only a matter of transmission. If it is very important, but it's also very hard to prove. And perhaps most important, that this distinction is not obvious. So it is not likely that different scribes or different authors chose the same distinction independently. A distinction between Cain and Abel makes sense, so I don't think that there is a connection between the Septuagint and those manuscripts of Onqelos, but what we saw in these Targums does suggest some kind of relation.
And so my point there was just to kind of emphasize that transmission questions are really primarily content questions.
Sometimes.
Mostly, more than we think. And if they are copying, they're understanding what they're copying, and they're doing it for reasons of explanation of the text.
Sometimes. Sometimes it's very dissolved.
I don't understand. Okay, we have to wrap it up because it's a break. You have coffee time. So thank you for me.